business or your home find it in your wallet, it originated at our business in town. And not only right in the local community did it make a huge impact, for 50 miles around, people were very, very surprised at what the impact was where the $2 bills were showing up. And I look at this paper as the $2 impact. It's how rural telecommunications providers impact not only the communities they serve, but also the urban areas all across the country. And with that, I'd like to introduce Hans Kuttner, and he's a visiting fellow here at the Hudson Institute and a former White House domestic policy staffer. So with that, I'd like to turn it over.
All right, Tom, thank you. Well, welcome all today, and I'm going to be talking about our new paper here, the economic impact of rural telecommunications, the greater gains, and it is available on Hudson's website and maybe also the FRS website at this point too. So if you're participating in this via the web link, you can go to hudson.org and download the paper and see the paper and follow along. If you're doing that remotely, you won't have the problem of hearing the pages turn like here if you are here, if you're trying to read ahead. But you can read ahead if you're participating remotely. We won't know about that. Let me get to this paper here. So in this paper, we're trying to understand the economic impact of rural telecommunications. And I really wish I had that $2 anecdote in mind, because that really is what we're trying to do here. We're starting off with the direct effects of rural telecommunications. And here we're going to talk about two questions. How many dollars are at stake? And secondly, how many jobs do those dollars support? And then we're going to talk about the indirect effects. And these are cases not so much of following the dollars where they're flowing around, this is not the $2 things, but this is more of a question of where are there effects that we see that are surely economic effects, but they're not of this follow the $2 around kind of sorts. And we'll be exploring those in a bit as well. And then we'll be asking questions about alternative scenarios. What if the world of rural telecommunications changed? And in particular, that one thing to think about is the importance of the Universal Service Fund, which is critical in this domain. And if that changed, that would lead to a very different world for rural telecommunications. We'll be trying to think about some scenarios about what that change could be. Well, so first, those direct effects. We're thinking about economic activity here, measured out in the economy, and what do we find? We find that the rural telecommunications industry has contributes $14.5 billion a year, that is using 2009 as our base year, to the economies of the states in which they are operating, $10.3 billion through their own operations, and $4.2 billion through the follow-on impact of their existence. And what about the job side? Well, we say 70,700 jobs are supported by rural telecommunications, and this includes both the people who are on the payrolls of organizations like Tom's, as well as out there elsewhere in the economy. And these are jobs that their existence is predicated upon the demand that comes from the rural telecommunications sector. And where is this economic activity taking place? Because that's really a kind of what I think the contribution here, the novelty of what we're coming up with here, is we are thinking about this not just contributing to the economy, but trying to divide it out between rural and urban. And we look at that economic activity, and we find that 4.97 billion of it is happening out in accruing in the rural area, while 64% of it, or 9.57 billion, accrues to urban areas. Then on the job side, of the jobs, 38,000, 54% are in rural areas, and 45%, or 32,000, are in urban areas. Now this is a little different. These shares are different, that there's a larger share of the economic activity accruing to the urban areas, while a larger share relatively of the jobs is accruing to urban areas. And so why is this? Well, one word answers that, and that is specialization. It's the degree of specialization that we observe in the economy out there. You know, you can think about the United States as being sort of a free trade zone where we allow goods and services to freely move around this landmass that we call the United States. And responding to the fact that you can grow strawberries in California and sell them in supermarkets in the East Coast, that you can freely grow corn in Iowa and sell it to cattle producers in Texas, creates specialization in the economy. And one aspect of that is then telecommunications. Well, rural telecommunications, by definition, is produced in rural areas. It's providing service in rural areas, but it's using inputs of a very different sort of the goods and services that are produced in rural areas to do that. And production of these inputs is happening where they can happen most efficiently. We don't say that coaxial cable has to be produced in every service area of every telecommunications company. We don't say that all the boxes, all the legal services that are used have to be produced in the service area. We have this, in essence, free trade zone here in the United States where we say they can be produced where the scale economies dictate where they can be produced most efficiently. And as a result, these economic activities concentrate, and they tend to concentrate in urban areas, which are not the areas where the service is provided. And I think that's the one takeaway point in this. The thing to be thinking about is how does this service, rural telecommunications, fit in with the larger pattern of the U.S. Economy? And then on the job side, where the rural area gets a higher share than it does of the economic activity, that reflects the fact that wages in the telecom sector are higher than they are in the economy overall. And so the relatively good paying jobs that you've got, Tom, are helping to keep the relative shares of those jobs in rural areas, but it remains that you can, despite all the people you employ, it's never going to be worthwhile for you to start your own coax plant, and you're always going to be buying that from someplace else. So that's the kind of patterns, relationships that we're seeing that's going on in the data and that we talk about here in this report. But what are these inputs for rural telecommunications? Well, we use the data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis to say, okay, for a business of this scale, of this size of annual volume, what are the kind of things they're going to be using? What are the inputs they require? And what we see among the most highest value inputs are things like advertising, architectural engineering services, land, legal, regulatory advice, banking and financial services. These are the kind of things which tend to aggregate in the more urban parts of the economy, and that helps give us some of the detail of why is it that we observe this pattern of the economic activity of rural telecommunications being so much taking place in urban areas. And to motivate that a little bit more, we provide some anecdotes and some stories of what's going on here, what's going on in some of these columns of this data in the report, talking about how if you're running a rural telecom company in West Texas, out in the hill country there, you don't produce trucks there, the bucket trucks you have, the trucks that you're sending out on the road to repair work, you buy them. And we have the example of a telecom company in rural North Carolina. They're buying them from a company in Charlotte. Well, that's sending some of the money is going to Charlotte. A portion of that value added from that economic activity is going to Charlotte. But the supplier there in Charlotte, they're not making the vehicles either. They're getting them from the manufacturers. And where are the manufacturers located? They're located in places like the Detroit metro area or Arlington, Texas. And that's the kind of pattern that we see that's going on here in the sourcing of the inputs used in the rural telecommunications sector. Now moving on to a question of indirect effects. In this direct effects, we've been talking about those $2 bills. Those $2 bills handed out and looking what is the pattern they form as they go out among the economy. Where is it that they're winding up? What do we see there? Now we want to think about something that is not so easily measured as these direct flows, but these indirect effects. And these are cases where telecom makes the flows possible. And this is a limitation maybe of this idea of following the $2 bills around, because the kind of assumption that's going on in this analysis is that it's like a cake recipe. You want to get, or a cookie recipe. You want to get, you can double it at will. You can make more. You can make fewer kind of things. But it's going to be the case that as we look at this, there are going to be some things where you just simply can't produce the product if the situation in the telecom sector changed. And those are what we're going to, a bunch of these things we're going to look at and call as the indirect effects of rural telecommunications. And so one class of these indirect effects occur when telecommunications are a limiting factor. That is, there's some kind of input here where, but for the telecommunications, that economic activity might not be happening. And one example of what we have in this area is telehealth, where you can think of a case where someone in a rural setting seeks the services of a specialized physician, provides services not available in that area, and via the telecommunications capacity is able to obtain those services sitting in the community they're in. They don't have to make the distance to travel. And if those telecommunication services didn't exist, they may not be getting those services. We observe a pattern of much smaller use of healthcare services in rural areas. And one part of that is this question of travel. Well, the telecommunications substitutes for the travel and makes this possible. So that is an example of an indirect effect, where if the doctor provides the telehealth service, the telecommunications part of it is part of those inputs that are required to produce the healthcare service, but we never see that as the catalyst that it is for making any of this happen. And then another class of indirect effects that we talk about in the report are where rural telecom companies serve as catalysts for other economic activity. And the kinds of things that fall in this category are the case of the where the telecom company often is the relatively largest, one of the relatively largest enterprises in a community. And so as they think about their business model, how do we make our business grow? It then becomes a matter of, well, our business will grow to the extent that we can increase the demand for our services in this community, which then makes them thus a vehicle for economic development. And in the report, we have an example from a county in New Mexico where the rural telephone provider had this catalyst kind of role along with the electric co-op in bringing about healthcare services, the reopening of a hospital there. And that's the kind of thing which are indirect effects, which don't appear in this. Now, another set of indirect effects, which is true both for consumers and for businesses, is this network effect. And this is this question of how value of a network increases more than the number of users. So if just the example, if you go from 10 to 11 telephones in a group of friends, you have more than just one more possible connection. And so that's this idea that each additional user on a network brings more than one more set of possible connections, creates a set of network effects. And these become very important for thinking about how these scenarios might play out for what would happen if we had significant change in the rural telecommunications sector. So one thing that characterized this sector, and that's why we have a lot of explanation in the back about how our commitment to universal service, the Universal Service Fund, is something that happens not as a result of the aggregation of demand among consumers, but because of the result of a policy commitment. We've made, as a country, made a policy commitment to having universal service, and that creates a level of support for service above and beyond what the local demand would be based on the incomes and the demand for services that people have. And so we asked the question, well, what if the commitment changed? And in order to do this, we turn to a set of scenarios. Now, scenarios is something that Hudson has done a lot of work with scenario development, and the notion here is not that we're trying to make a forecast, we're not trying to make a prediction, but rather we're trying to engage one's mind around what could be happening as a result of a particular set of outcomes, and using that to help clarify our thinking about this. It's very important historically, and originated in the defense side, thinking about what do you do if you see changes in the national security scenario, if you change in the threat. And so that we're trying to use that kind of thinking that comes from that world to think about what would happen if we had change in the rural telecommunications area. And it's a problem. We really can't appeal to the data, because in a world where universal service, where we have a world with 97% of households report that they have access to telephone services of some kind, we don't have the good kind of contrast of, well, what would a world with less support, less use look like compared to the world that we have. So it's hard to generate from going out and collecting the facts, the data out there, what do these counterfactuals look like. And so we explore two particular scenarios. What if there was a shock to the level of support through the Universal Service Fund? What if our national commitment to providing service of comparable levels in all parts of the country at affordable prices, what if that changed? Well, we think of two directions where those scenarios might play out. In one set of scenarios, the result would be higher prices for consumers, because in this set of scenarios, the responses would be dominated by price changes, by the providers of service saying, well, we now face the situation where we don't have as much support as we once did, and we will respond by taking this loss on our revenue side from one source, and we'll seek to replace it with revenue from another possible source, which is our customers, turning to our subscriber base as a way to deal with this revenue loss. The other scenario we consider is, well, okay, what if we're not going to focus so much on that revenue side, but we're going to focus on the cost side? And clearly the first place you go is you want to think about cutting capital costs. Well, what are some of the features of these scenarios? Well, in the higher prices scenario, some consumers will experience lower disposable income. Those who choose to stay with the service, who face the higher price, they would continue to have the service, but they would have lower disposable income that they could use for other purposes, and they would be less well off in that sense. Others would respond by dropping service. And the relative shares of these two kind of things are sort of empirical matters that would tend to work out over time. One thing that would happen would be the extent that the dropping service was important, or particularly important in certain geographic areas, while the response would be the risk of a rate spiral. That is that, well, one group of, in the first round, consumers respond, higher prices, they change their behaviors, they decide to not subscribe anymore. And then the next round, the company sees that the fewer subscribers, they respond by thinking, well, now we have a narrow rate base, so now prices have to go up, and this could continue onward as a rate spiral. What would be the other scenario that we consider is the capital investment cut. Capital investment is very forward-looking. The decisions about capital allocation have the opportunity to take in expectations not only about what's going to happen tomorrow, but for all the stream of time all the way out to the horizon, and to fold those backwards. And as you see that if you perceive what's happening is a permanent change in the level of support you're going to get, you're going to immediately respond to change, form new expectations about what the future is going to be, and what is the scope of your spending, which is most easily amenable to changed expectations about the future. It's your level of capital investment. And so the most rapid change would be to decline in capital investment, and then going forward there would be less capital investment. And then we think about the question, well, what happens then going forward from there? If the response is to say, okay, we're not going to make capital investment, well, that works today and it works tomorrow, but then you have the problem of either functional or actual obsolescence of equipment, the notion of the one hoche, that suddenly something drops off, and then that forces a real question of, well, what happens then? Do parts of the network lose viability? And there are a whole set of questions that would come into play at that point about do we have a less than universal commitment? Does the network serve fewer people? How are we going to play out that set of challenges that arise, were that to be the elements of that scenario to dominate what we observe. Well, what's the loss potential? In the long run, I take you back to network effects. That the diminished network means fewer possible connections, and fewer possible connections means both fewer consumers out there, consumers who become marginalized to the point that they drop off the network, and the contribution that they made to the overall scope of the network disappears. And on the other side of the market, on the seller side, that is a loss of potential customers to the potential sellers for whom telecommunications is one of the ways in which they reach their sellers. And that brings us back to where we are, thinking about the economic impact of rural telecommunications. We are we have questions here, and we have opportunity both for questions for people in the room, as well as those of us who are joining us via our webcast. Send your questions to hkuttner@hudson.org, and we'll be able to answer questions either from those who've joined us in person in the room or those who've joined us via the internet. So let me ask about questions. If we have any questions that formed in the process of this. People were not paging through fast enough to follow the report, I know, but I'm glad to tell you what page that question's answered on if it's going to be of that sort. Yes.
My name's Ted Gotch. I'm with Telecommunications Reports. My question is, this report, while it sort of looks at, am I right in saying that it's sort of more focused on what the aspect where it deals with universal service support, what that is today, as opposed to obviously the FCC is considering, wholesale reforms. This is we're looking at a today USF scenario as opposed to a potential tomorrow broadband world focused USF, and I just wondered if that was something, if I'm right in that calculation, or what I've gotten from this, what that really means. Is there any way to get a sense about what a future USF, if the effect would even be greater, lesser, any way to sort of look into the future and get a sense of that?
The notion here was to start off with that $2 bill kind of sense of the world, which is let's take a look at the world where it exists now and get a sense of just how big an industry is this and what are its effects overall on the economy in the way it stands now. Now, this is a part of the economy an industry where the industry model, the level of commitment, the level of resources that are involved in it, the level of economic activity is largely a function of the level of USF commitment that it has. So that's the baseline fact of where we're starting off here, which is this is the story of where we are today. And the questions we want to try to think about the future to get these scenarios. We want to get these scenarios to be generalizable enough that they would hold regardless of what the particular set of policy commitments, choices that were made underneath that kind of thing. So the idea is these are again, that's the notion of a scenario. It's not to be a prediction about what's going to happen to that. It's trying to look and say, okay, what are some kind of things that are out there that seem to be salient, that give you a sense of what could be going on in the world as you form your expectations about the future. And those two things about the future are dominated by, in the case of the consumer price thing, by price response by consumers. And that's the dominant form of the feature that's going to be there regardless of the nature of the subsidies, regardless of any particular policy changes that got to be made. And the other scenario is driven by expectations about future support, expectations about, and so what are the capital decisions that forward-looking actors in this marketplace make. And regardless of the particulars, the particulars may vary according to, as they respond to the particulars of the policy environment, the particulars of the policy choices that would be made, but the fundamentals that drive that are the notion that it's a forward-looking market, a forward-looking world, and in this forward-looking world, the way that you adjust immediately in response to these expectations about what's going to be happening this year, next year, 5 years, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, as long as your capital stock acts really, are going to be driven by what you expect, the expectations that you form today about what the environment will be like in that stream of years. And so price response, forward-looking expectations, those are the core of those two sets of scenarios, and they're going to be there regardless or of what the particulars of the policy environment turn out to be.
And if I may, the indirect effects are, as he stated, the value of having people connected to the network. Today's world, it's voice. Tomorrow, it's broadband, or even today. And he tried to represent the impacts of having those people be part of the network, the 97% voice today and broadband in the future.
Any other questions that have come up in the course of this presentation?
Check your email.
Are outside, because you said the Wi-Fi, our email support is coming from outside, in the outside room, so we'll get it. One thing I think is interesting to note about this this urban-rural kind of difference is getting back to this notion of the U.S. being a single economy with essentially a free trade zone within our country, is the difference between what's happens in a state like California versus a state like North Dakota. Well, California does a much better job of keeping that economic activity within California, while if we look at the tables, you'll see that North Dakota doesn't quite do so well. And what's going on there? Well, there's a lot less of that stuff that telecom providers need to get, that they're going to be able to get from within their own economy if they're located in North Dakota. That's putting North Dakota at the one end of the spectrum, and versus California, where a lot of those switches and things that you might need to buy, are going to find out that your supplier is going to have a California address for you, and that's helps create this sort of state level variation that we see in the impact at the state level. Question?
Given your numbers for rural telecom business impact today, do you think it's reasonable to assume that those impacts might be even larger if broadband access was ubiquitous? Your example of telehealth is a broadband example, not a telephone example. Many Buckley from Washington Independent Telecommunications Association.
So what we're trying to tell you about the economic relationships there, the way that $2 bills flow around the economy, and that's going to be can vary in the future. As far as this gets back to this question of where is it that telecommunications is a part of the product versus where it makes the product possible. In the case of the part of the product, well, in these dollar flows, what we're going to be seeing we would see in the future, where more of these services are used, well, just simply the portion of the dollars that go to the telecom provider would be seen in these tables that show you about what is the economic impact of the telecommunications industry, so that the rural hospital, that the amount of money that they pay to the hospital, to the telecommunications provider, that would show up in these charts in the future showing the scale of the industry. But it still wouldn't capture this catalytic kind of effect that I've been talking about, where it's an indirect effect, where these processes simply don't happen if the industry isn't present. A related kind of thing mentioned briefly in the report is this notion of what as an economist you'd call match quality, where you've got the ability for someone to be in a particular place dependent on this. And in some of these interviews with particular providers we did, talking to them about the things that they're buying, got some interesting examples of cases of someone who reports that he wants somebody who there's somebody who wants to have a large pipe sort of coming to them because they anticipate doing sort of financial trading. It's sort of one of their reasons for doing it. It's a place with some picturesque values. They want to be there. That's a higher match quality. Well, that's not going to wind up in the report if this company makes the decision, if this individual decides, well, because the rural telecom provider can't do it, I won't be locating in the rural area. We won't be capturing that, even in, regardless of how that decision gets made in the future. Yes?
All right, from Sheila Navis, the Rural Iowa Independent Telephone Association. When the report references urban and rural, how is urban defined?
So we're following the, we have to go where the data goes, and the data is coming to us from the, largely from the census, and it's the government decisions about what constitutes a metropolitan area and non-metropolitan area, and we're following county lines largely in that, and that's the kind of decision. So if you're in an area that's been attached to a metropolitan statistical area, then you're going to be showing up as being urban, and if you're not, then in this data as far as matching the activity of the industry to lines, that's, if you're on, not in a metropolitan statistical area, you're going to be counted as rural. And here, in the room.
Within the report, taking into account possibly people moving out of counties that don't have the needs that they need for, let's say that they have a small business. Let's say that they need to move to a different county to get those services.
Right.
Taking
Right. So we wanted to be as conservative and non-speculative as we could be in talking about the current economy. What is the current contribution of this industry into the economy? What is the current level of economic activity that is associated with it? What is the current level of jobs that are supported because of the current level of activity? And so that requires thinking about, well, this what if, counterfactually. Well, what if these services were available or not became available? And we thought it would be more straightforward to sort of say that, yes, there are these things. We think about these as indirect effects, but we're not trying to make claims that maybe escape beyond the data about what's the scale of those activities. More questions? We'll give one more chance to our remote audience if they have any. We'll check to see if any questions coming in remotely. And we haven't. Okay. Well, it seems that we have answered all the questions that there are here. And leave the screen here of hkuttner@hudson.org. Ah, just when you think yes. Just when you think yes. Go ahead.
My name is Royce Dermoniel, Coastal Indian Research. And I have a lot of friends that live on reservations and so forth. I was raised with no water, no electricity, so forth. And, no TV, anything like that. I wonder, is there resistance among rural people to broadband, to this initiative?
So the question is there resistance among rural people to broadband? I'm not going to speak to that question yet. I will say, though, one of the most interesting things to me in looking at the data about the areas where we've seen growth as with the last state to get above 90% of the population reporting that they had access to some form of telephone services was New Mexico. And what's true about New Mexico is it's a state with a lot of Indian reservation there. And so I think that's sort of an interesting thing to note about, is that one of these things that's going on is that how these most marginal spaces have been the last ones to come in, and as we sort of asymptotically approach the notion of we're at 97 point some percent there. What's been happening at that last few tenths of a percent has been those sort of most marginal spaces being come in. Now, on to your question about interest or resistance to broadband. I think we have here a provider who can tell us about trying to sell people on this product. What have your experiences been in trying to sell to your customer base this product?
For us, some of it, excuse me, is age related, that they either don't have a need or don't see a need until they find one, grandkids or whatever else. There are some economic reasons why they don't purchase the service, but just much like the most costly rural areas, the reservations are those. Those are the very sparsely populated. They're normally in an area that it's expensive to build and some of those things. So universal service has made it available, the REA for power, I'm sure rural water systems to be able to get water out to reservations, as well as not very sparsely populated areas. That had it not been for some of those mechanisms, it may still not be there, and we don't want broadband to be that same type of a opportunity that's missed. It's very important that it get out there. People are finding reasons that they need to be connected to the world, and as he mentioned again with the connections, one more connection, it may be grandkids that have traveled a long ways away, or maybe even just in a neighboring reservation or rural area.
I learned from a Stanford researcher that 70% of clicks on websites bleed usernames and personal information. And I was, I was wondering if people feel threatened by that. People that aren't, you can kind of take it for we're used to it, if you're in town and you click and Google comes up with stuff that, or Amazon suggests a book, or something like that. But
I don't hear that as a barrier. I don't hear that that's one of the reasons that they don't join or subscribe. It's either availability or one of the other reasons that I mentioned. It's not fear of data mining. It's fear of how to use it, how to operate the computer itself, or just don't see a need.
And age is, interestingly, this interest in this product, being an adopter of this product, isn't just simply a matter of rural folk in the U.S. I had an opportunity to have a conversation with someone who's done a survey in England, and they have the same kind of a very similar age gradient to adoption in the UK as they do at the US, where it's the case that they were dividing the population into quartiles of income, that the lowest quartile of income of people ages 18 to 25 have the same rates of adoption as the highest quartile of income of people over age 65. So it's the kind of that where this gradient here and that creates a sense of, well, among older populations of, so far I haven't heard a reason to adopt it. Of course, these grandchildren seems to be the ones who are selling the product to them. Huh?
And those that do adopt it, I believe, probably use it more than the ones that are in the middle of the age group. They seem to be using it most. I mean, not great quantities, not watching videos and things like that, but actually using it more hours of the day, connecting with people and finding reasons.
Thank you.
And any other questions?
Is the possibility of
Okay.
the additional revenue sources like internet and TV and whatever else you might be able to sell using your network reduce the need for a universal service fund? Support for the network?
I can, as a rate of return carrier, a rural carrier, we actually claim the broadband piece, not the internet piece, but the broadband piece of that revenue that we currently get today gets calculated into the revenue that we derive from it. So at least for a rate of return carrier, those are already calculated in the take rates or in the usage of broadband, voice, inter-carrier compensation, all those things. So more adoption will drive up more revenue, but it's already accounted for. So it's not like this new revenue source that's not been accounted for previously. And as adoption goes up, we actually have adoption rate that's close to 57%. And that revenue is calculated in that number when we calculate our rate of return.
Does the cost allocation rules make you take any of the cost of your network out and assign it over to the broadband side? So you're building all this local loop plan out to the end users to provide telephone service, and historically, before you started providing broadband, 100% of the cost of that loop was assigned to telecom service. But then as you've been able to roll out broadband, has any of the broadband been pulled out of the regulated side?
I'll try and answer this, I hope. That broadband piece that I talked about is treated as special access. So it's already accounted for as a special access piece for rate of return carriers. I don't know how it is for price cap carriers, but for rate of return, that special access piece is already counted in there. So the plant that goes into the physical connection, the pipe, whether it's doing voice or broadband and voice, that those revenues are counted in there. So driving up the penetration rates will drive more revenue, but the cost of that broadband network is higher.
If you've got 100 customers out there that have gotten used to paying $10 a month for voice service, and if you were able to sell half of those people on a broadband service for $30 or $40 a month, then each one who, if there's essentially minimal marginal cost anyway of providing broadband service over your network, then the fact that you can charge 2-3 times as much for a broadband line as you could for a voice line, seems like that would reduce your need for universal service. Assuming those numbers have been up or anywhere close.
No. Yeah, I was going to say that it's about double the first voice rate, but the broadband rate is actually higher, a little bit higher, but remember that's that special access piece. So the internet piece, which you're purchasing to do it, but just the cost of the loop shows up in the special access. So it's already accounted for it. So a portion of those charges that are charged to the customer, you get some from, it's kind of a three-legged stool. We have the piece that comes from the local customer, which you just mentioned. We also have inter-carrier compensation, and then we have universal service. Those three things make up the recovery of the cost of that network. So when we went from just voice and a little bit of broadband to voice and more broadband, we still have the same three revenue sources. It just means that as more comes from the customer, the local piece, whether it's a broadband something, or the minutes go up and it comes more from inter-carrier, that the universal number doesn't change. That's why we're building out more expensive networks, but the universal service has not grown substantially because it's either coming more from the customer in that special access piece, or the inter-carrier compensation has changed to pick up that piece. So more does help because it's just a de facto of divide the cost of the network by the revenue sources.
Feeding back to the consumers.
Back to the consumer.
Via the rate of return calculation.
Correct. That's correct. Because you've only got three sources. It's either going to come from your local customer. So if you cut universal service, you're basically placing it onto the local customer. If you cut inter-carrier comp, or the rates, the minutes fall off, you've got to make it up in one of the other two baskets.
That's a lot of detail there about
the
industry that I hadn't waded into the weeds that much on, and I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to teach me a bit more about the nuances of the industry there. Well, thank you for being with us today, and I hope you find this report useful and interesting, and we look forward to your comments. Thank you very much.
Was that clear?